Thank you very much. For me, it's a huge opportunity to stand here. What I will try to do today is to take you through from pollution to solution. And I have been an environmental activist for many years. I think the discussion if the climate change is man-made is over. The people who don't believe that, they could continue to not believe that, but the politicians, the reports, the scientific proofs are very, very strong. So where does that take us? I'm coming from a very rich country, Norway, in the north. I have been spending my life on environmental issues. I have been working with environmental issues since full-time, since '83. Then I quit school and started with this. I founded Bellona back in '86 after the Chernobyl accident. And since I'm coming from the Arctic, that's my background. And the Arctic is a kind of canary in the climate change discussion. We see a lot of changes there. And I have been working a lot in Russia. I've been working a lot with technology in oil and gas. And I think sometimes it's important to make actions. And I've been arrested many, many times. That's what people in Norway knows me for. But that's not enough. Sometimes it's also important to go further on. I've been spending a lot of my time in Russia. And when I saw the Times today, maybe with Mr. Brown, would like to go on with the nuclear strategy, that's dangerous for me. And I have been spending quite a long time on this. I don't know if you remember when France should carry out nuclear tests in the Pacific in the 90s. All the radical people, they went on the barricades and they really went on to fight. I think they boycotted French wine for up to a couple of weeks. For me, the situation is quite dangerous. Just beside the border of Norway, we have a storage facility. You have to explode 5,000 nuclear bombs at a similar size as the French did at Mururoa to create the amount of radioactivity that is in this storage. We started up in '89 when everything opened up, and openness when it comes to about information on the environment is extremely important. But in '96 we went into big trouble. Some of you maybe have heard about Mr. Nikitin. He was charged with secret and retroactive laws because the work he did for us. We spent 7 years in the court in Russia, and at the end we won against the security police. But my background from this work makes me very skeptical to the nuclear strategy. And I had to find some other solutions. We need some long steps to combat climate change. And for those of you who was early up this morning and looked at the telly, it was a reportage at BBC on the ice melting, a new big iceberg floating in the Arctic. Really, really scary. And the ice level is decreasing very heavily in the Arctic. We have a challenge. 80% of the global energy is produced by fossil fuel. 1% today is the new renewables. 6% is the nuclear. 7% is hydropower and so on. But 80% is fossil fuel. And the global energy demand is increasing. And 2/3 of the global population has a legitimate need for more energy. And at the same time, we need to cut the emissions between 50 to 80% to avoid an increase of the temperature with more than 2 degrees the next 100 years, which is, in itself is very scary. So what is going to make us to win that fight? That's a very complicated task, maybe one of the most complicated tasks we ever have faced as human beings. I think we all agree that sooner or later we need to move towards the sustainable energy systems with the renewable and so on. But how are we going to produce all the solar panels, all the silicium that is needed for this, all the aluminium for the cast around the solar panels, all the cast iron for the windmills, or all the fertilizer for the biomass, all the hydrogen for the nice car outside there. How are we going to do that? How are we going to make this transition? I think that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And that's why I, since 1993, has been working with one very important issue that I would like to spend most of my time on today, because I think that's the major solution that we need today, and that is carbon capture. Because this is a drawing from Bellona, 1993, on how to build a pollution-free gas power plant in Norway. And this has been, and again, I use Norway as an example. We are only a little part of the global CO2 emissions, but we are the third biggest oil and gas exporter, and we have the income of close to 3% of all the global CO2 emissions, so we have a huge moral responsibility. And governments has left because of this case in Norway, and we have created a political situation where we know that this is no potentially technical potential for this. Underground in the North Sea, we could store the CO2 emissions from Europe for at least 500 years of emissions. And in my opinion, this storage is very safe. So if we have the technology to split out the CO2 from the emissions and take it down under there, maybe this was a part of the solution we found out. We had a lot of ideas, but this turned out to be one of the best options we could see. For me, it's very important that when we fight on the environmental scene, that we have realistic solutions that could take us all the way to the goal. In Norway, we are very privileged. And since I worked in Russia, I had to, I don't know how, in the earlier days, the Russians tested you out when they wanted to make business with you. And since I worked very much with the nuclear icebreaker fleet, the director there wanted me to meet one of the icebreaker captains at lunch. That's heavy stuff, because it's big glasses of vodka. So he told me, you eat a lot of that cod liver. Okay, I said. And then you only drink clean alcohol. And stay away from the champagne, the mineral water, and the beer. Okay, why? I said. Oh, you just get a little bit drunk very long. Drink what's containing CO2 that will release the alcohol from the cod liver, and you will be very drunk. So I eat a lot of cod liver and stay away from all the mineral water. The point is that the CO2 has a chemical effect. And we could use that for enhanced oil recovery. And that is a way to pay the extra cost. In Norway, we have 6 oil fields that we could empty much more. We are a British sector, Norwegian sector. Most of the oil fields, we are just emptying 50% before the oil companies would like to go to the Arctic and drill in the virgin areas there. We have 16 more fields only at the Norwegian coast where you think that CO2 could go from be a waste to be a resource. We have 4 points where all the gas exported to Europe is passing. We could take out a lot of CO2 from these 4 points and remove it from the market, and without any changes in the infrastructure in Europe. So for us, as living in the richest country in the world, with some of the biggest pollutions of CO2 per capita globally, I think we are only beaten by Kuwait. If we take with us the income of the oil, I've been fighting with the oil industry to implement these new technologies. Today, it's 3 big projects going on in Norway for capturing the CO2 from power production, petrochemical plants, and we see the beginning of a new era. Of course, the first plants will be very expensive. But again, if we look at the cost of not making anything, they are much bigger. This is a scheme from the IPCC, the United Climate Panel. And I think that illustrates very much what kind of tools we have to combat climate change. Energy efficiency and conservation will be important. A little bit disappointing with the renewables. I'm more optimistic. I think that will play a bigger role. Mr. Brown should really read this, because nuclear is not going to take us to the goal. It's not capacity enough to sort it out. I think nuclear will be the solution. I don't like it, but I think it still will be the solution for some big cities. But I think we have to move to the distributed energy systems. Then the panel said, well, we could shift from coal to gas. But what's happening now is directly the opposite. We are moving from more and more to the coal industry. So, in my opinion, this is the potential for capturing CO2. Maybe as much as 50% of the weapons we have when we are going to combat climate change is probably carbon capture and storage. 3 years ago, the European Commission changed their view on carbon capture. And for me, that was a big victory. They had laughed a lot of us, I think, the same way that people laughed at Google when they started. But they established a technology platform, and for some reason, Norway is not even with the European Union. I was appointed to sit in the board, and I'm the vice chairman of this technology platform. We did the modeling. How much could carbon capture do to take us to the goal to cut the emissions in Europe before 2050? And that's 30 billion tons of CO2. It's possible to store, capture, and store. That means at the Spring Council, the European Commission admitted this was the strategy. They said that all power plants, new power plants from 2014, must be built so they could be retrofitted with carbon capture. All power plants that is built after 2014 will be forced to carbon capture from 2020, and all the old coal plants will be forced to retrofit from 2030. At the same time, we could clean petrochemical plants, steel plants, concrete plants, and we could produce the hydrogen. When we did the modeling for the Commission, we were also in Bellona quite surprised how big the potential were. 56% of the reduction within the European Union could come from carbon capture. And maybe as much as 37 to 40% globally. So this will be a new technology introduced in the energy market, and we didn't know about this technology when we negotiated the Kyoto Agreement. I'm, of course, in favor of the emission trading system. It gives us a price on the carbon, but it doesn't take us all the way to the goal. And for me, it's very important to show that it's possible to do something, but then, of course, as Al Gore says in his movie and in his speeches, we all have a personal responsibility. Definitely. And you guys have a much bigger responsibility than many other people's. But if you look at the stationary sources of CO2, there is 4,900 power plants that we could do carbon capture on. And there is 1,175 cement plants. All these big utilities could be cleaned, and the storage of CO2 should be possible. Well, couldn't this CO2 leak out again? Well, it's possible to investigate the geological structures very well up front. And today we have 100% leakage. So how much does this cost? It will cost around $2,500 billion to do the carbon capture on the 4,900 power plants that are located close to storage facilities. That's not very much more than today is spent on the war in Iraq. And that will reduce the global CO2 emissions with close to 40%. And that is the decision the politicians have to make. But the politicians very often would like to make this only to you and mine personal problem. But we need some more industrial ways of thinking. For me, it's important when I'm talking about the carbon capture and sequestration technologies to show that this is a wide range of technologies. As I said, We could clean gas power plants, coal plants, petrochemical plants, cement production, and also iron production. We could also use it for hydrogen. And I think coal is what's going to supply the energy with a lot of, the world with a lot of energy the next 100 years. I hope that's not true, but we have to plan that that could be the case. So what could we do with the coal industry? We could clean it. We could use the CO2 to empty the oil reservoirs that we already have started on. And remember, it's huge energy investment in all this steel construction and so on. Every year we could prolong their lifetime. We save a lot of energy. We could just store the CO2. But, and that is what I think is going to happen, we see that the world globally has a lot of deep, unminable coal fields. And I explained to you about the chemical effect of CO2 that I learned on the icebreaker. We could inject CO2 down to these deep coal fields and run off the methane. Then we could use the methane for production of hydrogen or power and put back the CO2 again. This is probably the way that US will head. I see now a lot of investments in Illinois and other states that have a lot of huge resources of these unminable coal resources, putting money into this. If we manage this, we could combat climate change and supply the need of energy for all the world's population. We could steam reform methane gas. You see the car outside here. How are we going to produce the hydrogen for that car? Back in '94, I made a back of the envelope calculation, and I saw, oh, the Commission wanted us to have 30% of the cars within 2030 on hydrogen. So the normal way to produce this hydrogen is to make it, put electricity into an electrolyzer and get out hydrogen. You burn the hydrogen in the car, the only emission is water. But it's 10,000 windmills globally today. And our calculation was that we had to build 67,000 1.5 megawatt windmills every year to manage to produce all that hydrogen. So we started to investigate the potential of using steam reforming of methane gas for production of hydrogen. And I'm sure that when the oil area is over at the British shelf, Norwegian shelf, it's a lot of gas. And I'm sure that in the future, we will have floating production facilities producing the hydrogen for the transport sector on all the stranded gas that is left over. So that the hydrogen will be produced by methane runoff by deep coal mines with steam reforming and injecting the CO2 back again. And the CO2 from this hydrogen production could be stored. And that changed a lot. So when I said that we could take 40% on the power generation, that's just the beginning, because this is the way we are going to supply the transport sector. The fuel cell technology we are now introducing in Norway in supply ships. We could run them on 70% hydrogen, 30% methane. We could store the CO2. We reduce the CO2 emission from the shipping industry with more than 50%. I was in China recently. It's more than 200 million tons of coal just burning in mines because they don't manage to put out the fire. So if I have the carbon capture technology, I could inject it in these mines and stop the fires. And this is the same amount of CO2 as all the aviation traffic globally, or all the cement production. So this is one of the markets that we see coming. This is a way of looking at the future from, again, United Nations. I have added some of it because I think that if we are going to produce enough solar panels and windmills and so on, we need to decarbonize the fossil fuel. And we could do it on bioenergy. Bioenergy is carbon neutral because it absorbs the CO2 from the atmosphere. If we then make energy or hydrogen of it, capture the CO2 and store it, we built the first plant that is carbon negative. And since the best way to predict the future is to invent it, I have created such a plant, and we would now like to invite business to come and build together with us the first plant that removes the CO2 from the atmosphere. Because if the greenhouse effect is really dangerous, then we need to produce a lot of fertilizers, grow a lot of biomass, produce energy, and do carbon capture. So let's go carbon negative. Thank you.
Thanks,